Hello and welcome to our webinar, Protecting New M&A Deals from Cyberattacks. Our webinar will begin in 10 minutes. While we are waiting for the rest of our attendees to join the room, please feel free to answer the poll questions located on the side of the screen. These questions that we have put together are to help RKON gain a better understanding of your company's security initiatives and to also inform attendees of common attack scenarios that are targeting private equity firms. We'll be starting shortly. For those of you who have just joined, welcome to our webinar, Protecting New M&A Deals from Cyberattacks. We'll be starting in 5 minutes. While we are waiting for the rest of our attendees to join the room, please feel free to answer the poll questions located on the side of the screen. To reiterate, the questions that we have put together are to help RKON gain a better understanding of your company's security initiatives and to also inform attendees of common attack scenarios that are targeting private equity firms. We'll be starting shortly. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Protecting New M&A Deals from Cyberattacks. Today's speakers, Chris Hankey and Joe Malarkey, have come together with over 50 years of combined security experience to discuss the reasons why PE firms have become prime targets for cyberattacks and best practices to recognize and thwart these attacks. We also wanted to remind everyone that by attending this webinar, you have the choice to receive a $100 Amazon gift card or donate $100 to the charity Toys for Tots. For those who have just joined us, please feel free to answer the poll questions located on the side of the screen. If you have any questions for our speakers following the presentation, please email communications@rkon.com and we'll respond shortly. We'll give one more minute for those who are joining the room and then we will begin.
We appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important topic of wire fraud that is having a major impact on the private equity industry today. We would like to welcome everyone and thanks for taking the time out of your busy day, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic turning our work and personal lives upside down in ways we could never have imagined. Talking about wire fraud is even more critical during times like these, as these are the unfortunate events of crisis that malicious actors turn up the heat on their prey while business and people are most vulnerable. Joe and I have both been in the security industry for over 25 years and have been on the front lines of many notable security events, drive the need for more security controls, risk management, and unfortunately government regulations. For example, when I was at Arthur Andersen and Firmwide Security, we had a SQL Slammer virus shut down our entire global back office financial operations, taking weeks to clean up. I was then thrown into crisis mode to work with the FBI addressing employees shredding confidential documents during the Enron scandal. It was unfortunate watching the accounting firm of 85,000 employees basically implode overnight and bring rise to the advent of Sarbanes-Oxley Act. After taking down the accounting industry, I thought that I would venture in the safe world of insurance by joining Marsh & McLennan. However, Elliot Spitzer, the New York State attorney at the time, thought that he would go after the Greenberg family, laying down billions of dollars in fines on Marsh, AIG, and Ace Insurance. Then after a stint at Zurich Insurance, I thought it would be fun to head up IT security at United Airlines, thinking after 9/11 and their bankruptcy, it couldn't get any worse, right? Wrong, it got worse. I was thrown immediately into a battle with various nation-state attackers attempting to gain access to thousands of ticketing gate computers in the international airports. In addition, I watched in awe as the price of oil skyrocketed to $180 a barrel, driving the stock prices for United and other airlines from $40 per share, bottoming out at $2 per share. I also took on the retail industry by heading up security for Ace Hardware. We fought a configured down add up virus infecting our entire Microsoft ecosystem with dictionary attacks and administrator passwords. It nearly halted the company operations for a few days and took 2 solid weeks of cleaning up and $500,000 in extra costs to remediate. The rest of the story is I'm still under a legal gag order, so we'll save those for another time. Joe?
Hi, thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Malarkey, and I'm a security consultant with RKON. I specialize in identity security, which means everything from anti-phishing to multi-factor authentication. I'm also a certified information systems security professional, as well as a Microsoft 365 certified enterprise administrator expert, which is probably the busiest certification title I've ever possessed. And yes, that means I know a lot about the Microsoft 365 suite and Azure Active Directory, but I've also been working with on-premise Active Directory since its beginning in 2000. Like Chris, yes, I've been in the IT industry for about 25 years. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and I've trained hundreds, probably thousands of IT professionals on identity and email services.
Great, thanks, Joe. Before we get to the presentation, we thought it would be a great idea to talk about a recent incident involving wire fraud. It's also great when we can use famous examples, and this one fits both of those categories. You've probably heard of it. Recently, Shark Tank host Barbara Corcoran was scammed out of nearly $400,000 in a simple email attack that tricked one of her assistants into wiring money to a phony real estate company. In an interview with People magazine, she said that her assistant had no reason to be suspicious about the email because Corcoran regularly invests in real estate. Like most wire fraud victims, she was not, quote unquote, hacked into. Instead, the cyber criminals used publicly available information to pose as a legitimate seller. In other words, they simply tricked her assistant into wiring money. That's how easy it is. These crooks just asked for money and they got it. Now, this is the kind of story that tempts people into saying that Barbara was stupid, but she really wasn't, and neither was her assistant. The assistant was unprepared, and the criminals managed to gain her confidence.
Yeah, Chris, and that's exactly why they call it a con job, right? The cyber criminals prey on their target's inability to readily spot unexpected scams. And so in this webinar, we're going to show you the tricks of the wire fraud game. We're going to give you an understanding of how these attacks take place, and we're going to teach you how to recognize and thwart these attacks. So to do that, we're going to split our talk into these areas. First of all, we'll talk about the common attacks and why attackers are targeting private equity. Then we'll talk about the main weapon in their arsenal impersonation via email. After that, we'll show some examples of what these attacks look like. Then, to show you how the crooks think, we'll go over the anatomy of a typical wire fraud attack. Then we'll talk about ways you can prevent these attacks, and we'll also give you some best practice takeaways. So, Chris, what are the common wire fraud attack scenarios?
Well, glad you asked that, Joe. First of all, wire fraud is a $26 billion industry, and it is growing. That's the FBI number, and they have only been counting since 2013. Every year it grows exponentially, and wire fraud comes in several varieties, the biggest one being CEO impersonation. However, wire fraud is not the only way criminals can profit through trickery. Let's talk about some of these common attack scenarios. Of course, at the top of the list is CEO impersonation. This is the largest contributor to the FBI's $26 billion number. Typically, the cyber criminal will spoof or fake an email from the CEO to a financial executive, directing that person to wire funds to an account. This is by far the most prevalent form of email wire fraud, but there are a few others that are related. In another scam, criminals will impersonate a supplier by sending an invoice to a company along with a changed bank account number. In both of these scenarios, the message seems legitimate and the wording will look very similar. In another type of scam, criminals will impersonate a high-level executive and attempt to modify the executive's direct deposit bank account number. This is the snatch and grab version of the wire fraud technique, since it is usually done only once before the real executives realize their paycheck didn't arrive. But wire transfers aren't the only way these crooks are making money. Another scam involves the impersonation of the CEO or even the IRS in an attempt to acquire sensitive employee information such as W-2 forms. The sheer volume of information that can be gleaned from just one company is worth tens of thousands on the dark web. Other forms of impersonation are growing also. Scams involving impersonation of IT or help desk personnel are on the rise. These schemes usually involve a help desk email or a phone call that lures a high-value employee into revealing their password or downloading ransomware. And rounding out our top list is attorney impersonation. In this scam, the fraudsters usually pretend to be lawyers who are working on behalf of a business partner or even a C-suite executive. The scam usually revolves around requests for confidential information, but may involve wire fraud. As you can see in the list, the criminal's tool bag is pretty deep.
Yeah, and as Chris was saying, the worldwide dollar amounts are rising exponentially. In fact, CEO impersonation, or what the FBI calls business email compromise, accounted for over half the dollar losses in 2019. And the growth of these numbers is eye-opening. In 2017, BEC totals were a little over 650 million. In 2018, that number jumped to over 1.2 billion with a B. In 2019, it jumped again to 1.7 billion. That's a $500 million increase in just 1 year. So let's get into why we're all here. The title of the webinar is Protecting New Deals from Wire Fraud. By implication, we're obviously saying that PE deals have become a favorite target of cyber criminals. The question is, why? Well, in a nutshell, PE deals have everything that the crooks are looking for. These criminal organizations are very smart. In fact, they're probably recruiting from the same schools that you're recruiting from. They're just looking for individuals with a little more, let's say, ethical flexibility. And just as they know what they're looking for in recruits, they also know what they're looking for in targets. They want easy money and lots of it. In their mind, that means large amounts of liquidity surrounded by confusion and rapid change. Sound familiar? By their very nature, M&A deals have all the qualities of a great target. We've listed some reasons on this slide. First, you have new teams working together for the first time in many cases. Also, there's usually a lack of mature financial controls combined with a fluctuating roster at key positions in the company. Next, there's often a lack of mature IT security controls, and sometimes no stable IT at all. Often, the IT responsibilities are transferred to a managed services provider who is always unfamiliar with the company's systems. And oftentimes, they're too busy just keeping IT going to worry too much about security. although they certainly should be worried about it. In fact, security should be at the top of their list, but many times it's just not. Next, there are often large numbers of vendors and often brand new vendors. For example, those that are replacing the lost functionality of financial and HR systems. And lastly, there are usually large sums of money moving around. Often this money is moving with short notice and to new and unfamiliar accounts. The attackers focus on C-level and financial leaders in these new M&A transactions because the cyber criminals know that personnel involved are expecting the unexpected, and new teams are less likely to question things that would normally throw up red flags and draw suspicion.
Yeah, Joel, and I'll also just add that transition times like these present these criminals with a perfect opportunity to masquerade as someone they are not and inject themselves into the communication flow. And as we'll see, that's pretty much exactly what they do. So let's review who's being targeted. We all alluded to this in a previous slide, but it's worth repeating because the methods that these fraudsters employ usually dictate that certain personnel are targeted in a certain way, and those targets are usually consistent. First and foremost, there is the CEO. This person is usually the source of spoofed or forged email messages in most wire fraud scenarios. The CEO positioned as a natural target for the crooks. They're looking for quick and obedient action on the part of the subordinate. And a CEO can usually get that kind of action rolling on quickly. Of course, in M&A deals, this could also be a well-known person at the top of the PE firm. Unfortunately, these days, any CEO, especially one involved with an M&A deal, must be aware that they are a target. Other targets include members of the financial team. This is especially true for personnel who control bank accounts and payments, but also includes billing personnel. An emerging target in the last few years has become human resources and payroll personnel. This is due to their access to employee information. The main things we'll be repeating are the questions you see on these slides. Do other executives really know if emails are from the CEO or genuine? Does the financial team know who they are working with on the phone and email? Does the human resources team know who is requesting employee W-2s? And when users get a call or email from the help desk, is it really the help desk?
Yeah, Chris, and we pose these questions because, as we'll see, detecting impersonation can be difficult. However, just knowing that it's a real possibility and knowing what it looks like can often give most of us enough of a pause to reconsider whether a sudden email request for a $500,000 wire transfer should be confirmed by a separate phone conversation before the money goes out the door, never to be seen again. Let's take the case of an Italian energy firm, TECNIMONT. This is a large $3.6 billion corporation that has a subsidiary in India. A little over a year ago, the Indian subsidiary lost over $18 million to cyber criminals. No guns were used. There were no midnight heists like we see in the movies. The crooks simply asked for the money. And they didn't just ask once. They asked for and received payments in 3 separate wire transfers. It all started with a spoofed email purportedly from the global chairman to the head of the Indian subsidiary. The email looks similar to the global chairman's email address, so it fooled the subsidiary head. The hackers convinced the subsidiary head to transfer a total of $18.6 million in 3 separate transactions about a week apart. On the 4th attempt, somebody finally questioned it. Along the way, the crooks impersonated other figures like lawyers and key executives in a scam that revolved around a phony confidential acquisition of another company in China. They even arranged conference calls. Again, these guys are not playing around, and they're very well rehearsed. This is a big business, and these crooks have top-notch players on their team. As a result, TECNIMONT, the money was immediately withdrawn from the receiving bank and was never recovered. And of course, there were employee terminations.
And that's the beauty of wire transfers, right, Joe? Usually the money can be transferred and then quickly withdrawn, and there's usually no getting it back. The banks are not on the hook for it because an authorized person requested the wire transfer. The bank is just doing what it always does for its client. However, as we will discuss, there are things you can do if you act quickly enough. The idea, though, is to prevent it in the first place. So let's talk about email impersonation. It is by far the primary attack method used in wire fraud. We've mentioned a couple of terms already, but we'll be talking about them throughout the presentation, so let's go over them now. Phishing is a general term used to fool someone into doing something they shouldn't. It usually involves email, but it can also come in the form of phone calls and text messages. Spear phishing is the specific targeting of a known individual. Now, that we are talking about in this webinar is called whaling. Whaling is a spear phishing of a whale. In this context, a whale is a high-level executive like a CEO. These are the people who can facilitate large wire transfers, and so they are the primary targets of email-based wire fraud, or what the FBI calls business email compromise. Leave it to the government to use confusing terms to describe something like wire fraud. Another term we've used is spoofing. Spoofing is the forging of an email address. And we'll see a little later, this can take several forms. Some are easy to spot, and some are not.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. Here's the typical form of a whaling attempt email. You can see that this email is from the CEO of Newco, Joe Smith. Joe is asking Jim, a financial executive, to wire money to a vendor by the end of the day. Joe can't do it because he's in Aruba and doesn't trust the internet connection. Now, maybe Jim gets these kinds of messages once in a while and he doesn't think twice about making the payment. And that's the beauty of these scams from the criminal's point of view. Now, looking at this slide, it may seem obvious that this is a scam, but that's because we're in a webinar talking about the scam. To an unsuspecting executive like Jim, though, it might seem perfectly ordinary. Now, in just a couple of minutes, we'll revisit this email when we talk about how to spot some of the common signs of these scams. And of course, we'll also talk about how to avoid and prevent them.
So we've talked about the general method of the scam being an email message, and we've talked about who the main targets are. Now, let's see the general flow of the messages. As you can see on this slide, which comes directly from FBI statistics, the spoofed emails predominantly come from the CEO. Other spoof senders include managing directors, presidents, chairmen. You get the idea. It's going to be someone who can make that financial demands, right? Then on the receiving side, it's usually the CFO or director of finance. These are going to be the people who can make the money transfers. The math is pretty easy. The CEO asks the CFO to wire money for something seemingly legitimate reason. It's that simple.
Yeah, that's true, Chris. The best scams always are. These crooks know how business works. Long gone are the days of the Nigerian prince with some sob story about how he can't bring money into the country without your help. Again, these criminal groups are well funded, they're well educated, and well rehearsed in their craft. Okay, so let's look at some typical examples of these scams and how to spot the signs of an attack. So this is the slide that we showed you earlier. There are some signs here that are common in these kinds of attacks, and when you know about them, you can spot them. First of all, look at the email address at the top. Now, the email address isn't always visible, but when it is, it should never be a personal email address from gmail.com or outlook.com or any non-business address. Personal email accounts are too easy to acquire. This one says jsmith@gmail.com. But an attacker could easily sign up for joesmith@gmail.com or josephsmith@outlook.com. That's just a no-no right off the bat, but there are even more common signs. 3 of the most repeated and consistent signs of email fraud are urgency, secrecy, and scare tactics. The crooks are looking to get things done fast and quietly, so you will almost always see language that includes a timetable or a deadline. You'll also see a reason to keep things quiet. In addition, many times there will be an element of fear or scare tactics. The fear usually reinforces the urgency or secrecy of the message. In this example, you can see that Joe is telling Jim that an important invoice is past due. Joe can't take care of it himself and needs Jim to wire the vendor. Since it was a bit of a screw up, Joe is asking Jim to keep quiet about things. Notice how Joe conveniently provides the routing and bank account numbers. The crook can't have that money go into a legitimate bank account, now can they? Now, these attacks are usually tailored to the specific individuals involved, and we'll discuss shortly how the crooks manage to successfully target those specific individuals. So here's a different example. In this message, an executive with a nice salary and a direct deposit is asking a payroll employee to change their bank account number. Notice the secrecy and favors. Jim doesn't want Sue to tell anyone he forgot to change his account on time. Now he's asking Sue to do him a favor and make an out-of-policy change. Also notice the urgency and fear. The phony Jim here is closing on a house and is counting on that money arriving in his account on time. On this next slide, we have an example of crooks attempting to acquire information about employees. This information is worth a lot of money on the dark web. These days, even one single person's information is valuable. You can imagine what the value is of the cumulative financial and personal information for 1,000 gainfully employed people. Again, notice the fear, the urgency, and the secrecy. In this case, the email ends with Jim requesting that John keep things quiet because IRS audits look bad for business. Urgency is the #1 tactic in these attacks. It will almost always be present. The crooks don't want anyone thinking too long about what's going on. Secrecy is also usually present. The crooks don't want too many people involved because that increases the risk that someone might have a moment of clarity.
And scare tactics are an effective way to reinforce the urgency and secrecy. If you see a message asking you to do anything quickly and quietly, don't believe it. Unfortunately, change and volatility are baked into many merger and acquisition deals. Things are happening quickly, and sometimes important items must be fast-tracked. The crook knows this, and that's one of the main reasons they target M&A deals. Let's talk about how these criminals think and how a typical wire fraud is carried out. In doing that, we'll talk about how the criminal's job is actually made easier by the M&A process. There are usually 4 steps to the attack. We'll go through these steps individually in the next slides, but they're all here on this slide. Step 1 is using publicly available information to find out about companies that are in transition and where funds are likely to be moving around rapidly. Once a company is identified, step 2 is a targeted research on that company. Step 3 is developing a plan of attack that best matches that particular company. And step 4 is executing the attack. Now let's take a closer look at these steps. As we said, step 1 begins with publicly available information. In the case of mergers and acquisitions, this is the same deal information that you're all using. Hackers are subscribing to private equity publications and searching for deals where a new team is likely working together for the first time. Names of executive leadership, phone numbers, email addresses, even names of vendors are all there, waiting to be absorbed and incorporated into the attack.
Exactly, Chris. And once a target company has been identified, the crooks will perform their own diligence on that company. They'll use internet searches to find information and news about the company. Then they'll go to the company website and look at the leadership flow chart and bio information. They'll see key vendors and partners and possibly glean information about ongoing or upcoming transactions. Company websites are typically full of this information, and the crooks know it. The criminals will also comb through social media sites looking for executives' information. Facebook, LinkedIn, even Instagram and Twitter. From there, they can find friends and colleagues, job history, education details, even vacations. Crooks love vacations. The person is out of town and probably unwilling or unable to communicate in a normal fashion. Vacations are a really good time to strike. We'll talk about this in the checklist, but never post anything about vacations on social media. Don't even post a picture of a beach or a resort until you're back home. We all know what a picture of a resort means, right? It means you're gone. Now, the crooks might even go so far as to become your Facebook friend or LinkedIn colleague. Maybe that long-lost high school acquaintance that just friend requested you isn't really who they say they are. Again, these cyber crooks are bold and not afraid to interact with you and even call you on the phone if they think it might increase the chance of a successful attack. They may even do physical reconnaissance. There are plenty of stories of USB drops in public places or even the company parking lot. These USB devices are sometimes quote unquote dropped on purpose. These devices often contain ransomware to encrypt your information, or they could install a keyboard logger to steal your passwords. Imagine an executive that takes frequent lunch trips to a local cafe with their laptop and uses a particular brand of USB drive. As a crook, I could just buy the same brand and drop it next to that person's foot one day.
Yeah, Joe, there's something about USB drives that begs you to plug them in, isn't there? But that's what makes USB drops attacks so successful. You know what they also say, Joe? What you find in a Starbucks bathroom stays in the Starbucks bathroom.
Okay.
In Cyberrecon, the plan gets developed further. The crook might register lookalike domain names and create email addresses that appear similar to leadership email addresses. They will also research upcoming financial transactions with an eye toward redirecting wire transfers or even mimicking them in a similar transaction. They will also leverage data collected from physical surveillance of leadership. Observations overheard within confidential conversations in airports and coffee shops are a great tool for the crooks. Lastly, at this point, they might engage in some preliminary spear phishing emails that include links and downloads in an attempt to steal passwords. Passwords are the holy grail for these criminals. With a password, they don't even have to fake their email address. They can actually use your real email address and your account. Once they get a CO password, the sky's the limit. So that brings us to the execution of the attack. In the typical attack, the CO's email address or close lookalike is used to implement financial wire fraud. In another typical attack, an email to the HR department is used to steal employee information for sale on dark web. In a third typical attack, an email purportedly from an executive is used to redirect a payroll deposit. And in yet another typical attack, an email from someone posing as a help desk is used to acquire an unsuspecting executive's password.
Right, thanks, Chris. So from the beginning to end, here's what the path can look like. It's not the only path, but this would be the preferred path where possible. First of all, the CEO's password might get compromised and stolen. Then the attacker could access the CEO's email undetected and wait for high-value information. After that, the attacker can identify the new company's financial and executive communications. They can see the vacation and busy times in their calendar. They might even see upcoming wire transfers. At that point, they can go ahead and initiate a wire transfer request to a financial executive using familiar language. After that, the attacker could delete the emails from the sent folder, hiding their activity. At that point, they're probably going to receive the wire transfer. Hopefully not, but it happens all the time. And after that, well, then the attacker is going to find a nice island to buy. And they can do this all from halfway around the world. So in these talks, there are always questions about how the crooks impersonate email addresses. Well, sometimes it's a lookalike domain. For example, look at the top name here. That O in new co is actually a 0. Now, can we reasonably expect someone to recognize that they're looking at a 0 instead of an O? Sometimes it's more obvious. Look at the second example here. As we've said, personal email addresses should never be used since they're way too easy to acquire. Now look at the third example. The third example here is perfect. We all know that password theft can lead to this, but there are also ways for savvy crooks to manipulate email messages to show the actual address of a CEO or other executive, even without gaining access to the executive's password or account. The bottom line is this: you just can't trust the from address. You might not even see the email address. Instead, you might just see a friendly name, and even though you can sometimes hover your mouse over that name to see the underlying address, it still might be a fake. Now, there are IT-related techniques that can thwart this type of address spoofing, but the general adoption of these techniques on the internet is still very poor at this time. I know it seems unbelievable that we're still unable to easily confirm the from address, But the problem is that internet email wasn't built with security in mind, and it's been very difficult to retrofit that security around it.
So what specific steps should you take if you discover that your company is a victim of wire fraud? First, everyone must be trained to immediately report the fraud to executive leadership. Second, you should invoke an incident response plan if it exists. And if it does not exist, hopefully after this webinar it will. Third, immediately contact both the sending and receiving banks and request a recall. Time is a factor here in attempting to stop or recall the transfer. These crooks don't wait around. They will withdraw the funds as soon as possible. Fourth, if the transfer was international, it was probably carried by the SWIFT system. In that case, have the banks request a SWIFT GPI recall. Additionally, in SWIFT transactions, if the transfer was over $50,000 and a SWIFT GPI recall has been initiated, you can request that the FBI invoke their financial fraud kill chain. This is best done by contacting your local FBI office. Again, time is a factor. And in fact, the FBI probably won't even bother if it's been over 72 hours. The benefit of the kill chain is it carries the weight of the United States government, in which gets the attention of everyone involved. The kill chain was created to help stop international wire fraud. And corporate wire fraud usually involves a SWIFT system, since money is always transferred out of the target's country. There are no guarantees, but the FBI kill chain increases the chances of a recovery. Fifth, inform any business partners involved. They might not know of the incident and might fall victim to further attacks if they remain uninformed. Number six, here may be redundant, but we all know human nature. The set it and forget it attitude is alive and will even at the top of financial institutions. Always verify that the wire recall and/or SWIFT GPI recall have been initiated. Remember, the SWIFT recall is a prerequisite for the FBI financial kill chain. Number 7 on the list is document everything. If you get to the financial kill chain, the FBI is going to ask you for every detail of the transaction and who was involved. But go further than that. Every action you take and every detail you notice will help you prevent future incidents. Lastly, you are encouraged to always report incidents to the authorities, even if you didn't qualify for the FBI kill chain. But of course, that's up to you.
Yeah, we understand the sensitivities involved with these kinds of incidents. It's the nature of the business. So let's move on to the prevention checklist and best practices. First of all, remove email as a single avenue to wire transfers. Implement two-step verification, such as a phone call or a face-to-face visit for the following: new or changed wire transfers, employee information requests, direct deposit change requests, and vendor payment change requests. This extra step will immediately reduce the risk of a successful attack. Next, limit the number of people who are authorized to complete transfers, and also limit the individuals who have access to employee information and payroll systems. Also, as we've said, never conduct business to or from a personal email address like gmail.com. They're just too easy to get. Next, never give your password to anyone, especially IT or a help desk person. They should never ask for it. And if they do, they're probably not actually from the help desk. Next, be cautious about clicking on links in emails. Also be careful of downloading attachments that you're not expecting. These are excellent ways for criminals to infect your machine with keyloggers and ransomware. We'll talk about how IT can help with this in a moment. Now, occasionally you will receive legitimate emails instructing you to change your password. However, never follow the link inside of the email. Links in emails are never fully trustable. Always travel to the site yourself by typing the address in manually or by performing an internet search for the website. Search engines are pretty good about scrubbing phony sites from their results pages. Next, as we said, don't post company information or vacation schedules on social media. As we talked about, the crooks use social media sites to find information that they can't find in other sources. Also, don't insert USB drives into your computer. USB drops are an old school trick that still works. And finally, be aware of the criminal presence in public spaces, especially when connecting to new or unfamiliar wireless hotspots. It's too easy for a crook to sit poolside and advertise a Wi-Fi connection that looks similar to the hotel or coffee shop's Wi-Fi. Always ask employees for the name of the Wi-Fi connection. As you can see on this slide, the hacker signal might even be stronger than the actual hotel's signal. Well, that's because the criminal is probably sitting a few feet away from you. All right, now this is not a technical webinar, but in addition to the checklist, we'd like to give you something for your IT departments. We've whittled down the list to the most important IT-related mitigations that can help thwart and even stop the kinds of attacks that we've discussed in this webinar. First, ask about what kinds of email security are in place. For example, are messages being scanned for malicious web links and attachments? Does your email system have anti-phishing rules in place? Is there a program for end-user security awareness training? Very important. Also, has the IT department implemented multi-factor authentication? Multi-factor authentication is also called two-factor authentication. This is an additional factor in addition to your password, and it protects against stolen passwords. Even if the crooks steal a password, if they manage to steal a password, it is exponentially harder to also have the second factor, like an authenticator app on your phone. Lastly, ask if conditional access is being used. Conditional access to things like email, when it's based upon conditions such as user location and abnormal logins, has been shown to significantly reduce attacks. So there are many products on the market that can help with these mitigations. For example, the Microsoft 365 Cloud has several security offerings built right in.
Thanks, Joe. And there are also companies like Mimecast and Okta that hold very good positions in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for these types of products. For example, here's an example. This email system is warning this user about a message where the sender has the same name but a different email address as another person with which the user communicates regularly. In another example, here's an example of a authenticator pushing out a multi-factor authentication prompt with a phone app. Over 80% of data breaches involve weak or stolen credentials, and MFA is a great way to mitigate the password problem.
Yeah, these examples that Chris is showing really demonstrate that identity is the new network perimeter. You know, we used to operate in the world of firewalls and network perimeters with intrusion prevention systems on that, and that was not all that long ago. These days, however, that perimeter is becoming less relevant. How is a firewall going to help me if I access my Office 365 email from my iPhone while sitting in my car? It isn't. The new paradigm is identity protection. Companies like Microsoft and Okta gather information about identity and logons from millions of authentications every day, and they can use common signals from these logons along with conditional access and multi-factor authentication to make decisions about whether an individual logon can be trusted. The science is getting stronger, and we just need to be taking advantage of every opportunity to strengthen our identity protection. For example, if I log on to my email from an iPhone in Chicago on Tuesday morning, it's improbable that I would then log onto my email from a Windows device in Russia on Tuesday night. These are the kinds of login attacks that a properly configured system can and should detect.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways from this webinar? First, due to the nature of their business deals, private equity firms are being targeted by cyber criminals. That's just the way it is. What you want to do is present less of a target than the next company. Now that may sound a little selfish, but I'm sure it doesn't surprise anyone here. It's common sense. If your house is harder to break into than your neighbor's house, then the crooks will probably move on to your neighbor's house. Therefore, awareness of the problem is critical. Our hope here is today that by having shown you a few typical examples and reiterating the criminal's use of urgency, fear, and secrecy, that you will be better equipped to spot an attack. Once an attacker has been identified, they'll usually move on to the next target. Lastly, we're all in a hurry, and mistakes will be made. We can't put this entirely on IT anymore, but we do need IT to proactively work on modernizing our identity and email security. There are products out there that can mitigate a large number of these attack vectors, but these products are often misunderstood and underutilized. We encourage you to engage an IT provider that has experience in these types of mitigations and can work with you to prioritize and improve your security posture. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and hope you found value in the content that we provided today around how wire fraud is affecting the private equity space.
This concludes our presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Joe and Chris. If you have any follow-up questions for our speakers regarding the presentation, please email communications@arkon.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. We hope you've enjoyed our webinar and have a great day.